That's fine. Adjust it in terms of location. Yeah, it's actually holding up my script. So, all right. And my voice works this way. Okay. Um, um, good question. Good point. What slide now? My opinion, people are online waiting for Okay. Alrighty. Okay. So, good morning. Does this sound like a mic? Can you hear me okay? Okay, cool. Okay. Good morning, all. Thanks for coming. I'm Julie Saylor from the Maryland department. First, I have a few announcements. Get ready for Halloween by attending our October Spooky Maryland series programs. Join us next week on October 3rd for our program Maryland Mayhem, Scoundrels, Spies, and Sinners in the Free State, where you'll hear 6 historical true crime tales that took place in Maryland. On October 10th, you will not want to miss Haunted Maryland. It's Supernatural Haunt with tales of hauntings across the state. And then on October 17th, Mediums, Magicians, and the Ouija Board, a spiritualist history of Baltimore. Hear about the Ouija board, spirit mediums, and magicians who work to discredit them. And on November 16th, we'll be hosting Gordon Shuffelt, author of the book The Uncommon Case of Daniel Brown, which examines race and policing in late 19th century Baltimore and demonstrates that many of the issues surrounding the Black Lives Matter movement today have been with us for a very long time. On December 4th, you won't want to miss From Twilight into Sunshine, LGBTQ plus history in Maryland, which will be presented jointly by Pratt Library librarians and Baltimore Heritage LGBTQ plus history walking tour guides. And then finally, we'll have a genealogy circle program on January 27th in 2024 about the genealogical resources that can be found on the Digital Maryland website. You can keep up with all of our upcoming programs by going to our site's events page at calendar.prattlibrary.org. You can limit the types of programs you want to see by selecting Maryland Interest or Genealogy under the event type area to the right of the page. You can also search the programs by name in the search bar at the top of the page. All of our programs are free, and we try whenever possible to live stream these online and record them for future viewing. So now on to today's program. Fascinating women buried in Baltimore's historic cemeteries. Our presenter today is Kathy Santora, president of the Maryland Women's Heritage Center, which works to ensure the accomplishments of Maryland's women, past and present, are recognized, documented, and celebrated. As a freelance writer, she is also the co-producer of Dying to Tell Their Stories, a blog that looks at the lives of people buried in Baltimore's historic cemeteries. The Maryland Women's Heritage Center preserves women's history with research, programs, and special events. A statewide nonpartisan organization, the MWHC also has an event space at 333 North Charles Street in the location of the former Women's Industrial Exchange. And we're going to be holding questions until the end of the program. And if you're attending virtually, feel free to submit your questions in the chat box. So let's welcome Kathy Santora.
Thank you. Thank you, Julie. It is truly a pleasure to be here in this beautiful building. For my fellow Marylanders who haven't been to the Enoch Pratt lately, you need to come down and visit this place. It was restored a couple of years ago, and it's truly a gem of a landmark in Baltimore. Enoch Pratt, of course, was one of the most well-recognized names in Baltimore from the past. He came to Baltimore with only $150 to his name and built a fortune that really did change Baltimore forever. But what was his wife's name? I'm going to be honest with you, I had to look it up myself. I didn't know either. His wife was Maria Louisa Hyde Pratt. And the Pratts lived at this house that's shown on the screen at West Monument and Park Avenue. It is right next to what is now the Maryland Center for History and Culture. The Pratts had no children. However, they both really believed in equality and built this library for everyone. Now, Mr. Pratt gets a lot of well-deserved recognition for his immense contributions to Baltimore. But we know less about Maria, but I'm kind of thinking that she was very much supportive and maybe even very involved in some of the generosity that Enoch Pratt gave to Baltimore. We definitely need to find out a little bit more about her at the Maryland Women's Heritage Center. After Enoch's death, Maria lived in the house with her two sisters until she died in 1911. The Enoch Pratt, Maria Louisa, and are buried together in the large grave marker in Green Mound Cemetery. Maria's sister, Sophia, is buried with them just a little bit behind the marker there in a smaller gravestone. Now, this is also a true Baltimore landmark, and it happens that Maria Louisa and Sophia's parents, Samuel and Catherine Hyde, were founding members of the Baltimore's first Unitarian Church. And since we are in the neighborhood, we are just down about 2 blocks south of that church on Charles Street. The Maryland Women's Heritage Center is located in the former Women's Industrial Exchange. And at the end of today's program, I'll tell you a little bit more about some of the research that the Maryland Women's Heritage Center has done at that site, about the site, and about the people and the women who worked and were customers at the Women's Industrial Exchange. So the women whose grave sites we will visit today were all alive in Baltimore during the 1800s. They were all fascinating to me, all different from one another, and we remember them all today. Now, in Baltimore, Edgar Allan Poe gets a lot of attention, and he should. But there were two women in his life that changed his life for the better. His wife, Virginia Poe, and his mother-in-law, Maria Poe Clem, are buried with him at Westminster Burying Ground, also just a few blocks away from here. This is a really historic area, and it always has been, and it's just a beautiful place to be and to walk around. The fact that they were buried with him shows their importance in his life. So the backstory is that Edgar Allan Poe was destitute and estranged from his Virginia family. He came to Baltimore around 1832 to live with his Aunt Maria Clem at number 3 Amity Street. There were other family members in the house, including Maria's 10-year-old daughter, Virginia. The move changed the lives of Edgar, Maria, and Virginia. Maria was a plain and hard-working woman, but she was a stabilizing influence on Edgar, and in turn, Poe was devoted to her. Once the 27-year-old Poe married Virginia when she was 13 years old, he took to calling Maria Muddy. Poe's 1849 poem, To My Mother, reflects their affection for each other. So the marriage of these cousins is a debatable topic that has probably gone on for years. Even in those days, the age difference was a bit scandalous. We don't know a lot about Virginia. We know that she was a young woman of startling beauty with dark hair and brilliant eyes. She herself wrote at least one poem, an ode to her husband on Valentine's Day, 1846. And there's a technical term for this type of poetry. Maybe somebody knows, but the beginning, yes, the beginning letters of each of the line on the poem spells out his name. Now, Virginia possessed a memorable singing voice and played the harp and piano. One evening, she was performing when she suddenly began bleeding from the mouth. It was a sign that the tuberculosis that would end her life, and it did, on January 30th, 1847. Poe was despondent and remained so for the rest of his life, sinking into alcoholism and most say, some degree of madness. People in Baltimore never forgot the Poes. In 1875, a grave monument was dedicated to Edgar Allan Poe at Westminster Burying Ground. Now, the remaining Poe family didn't have much money, so in order to raise funds for a proper gravesite, a woman named Sarah Sigourney Rice and her fellow Baltimore teachers encouraged students to contribute pennies for Poe, and they organized special events to raise money for the gravestone. Later on, Maria and Virginia were reinterred with him. And just as a side note, Miss Rice is buried in Mount Olivet Cemetery, which is on Frederick Road. Elizabeth Patterson Bonaparte is famous for her brief but stormy marriage to European royalty. She was the daughter of a wealthy Baltimore merchant, as well as beautiful, educated, and charming. So it was probably all these traits, as well as her impeccable French, that captivated Napoleon Bonaparte's 19-year-old brother Jerome when he met 18-year-old Elizabeth here in Baltimore. Just a few months later, they were married. Now, Napoleon was appalled by his brother's marriage to this Baltimore commoner. He withdrew Jerome's allowance and had the marriage annulled in French courts. After that, Elizabeth never saw her husband again. But for the rest of her life, she insisted on keeping up the aura of nobility that she felt that she had earned through the marriage to Jerome. She traveled, she dressed beautifully, socialized, and shopped with a European flair, and turned a temporary small pension paid by Napoleon into remarkable wealth. She was a very astute businesswoman and was careful with her money. She actually never owned a home, but she spent a lot of money on the good life. Despite having such a life, she remained bitter up until the very end about her rejection by European royalty. As she aged, Elizabeth lived alone in a boarding house in Baltimore's Mount Vernon neighborhood. She owned a lot of properties, and people spotted her walking between her properties in her later years, collecting rent. At her death in 1879, Elizabeth was worth about $1.5 million, which is a remarkable sum for a woman of those times. So if you don't right away recognize the name Harriet Lane Johnston, you will in a minute. By the time Harriet Lane was 11 years old, both of her parents had died. Her uncle, James Buchanan, was a U.S. senator and stepped in to become her guardian. Now, early on, James Buchanan recognized something special about his niece. He ensured that she got the best education. With his political future rising, he also encouraged Harriet and her exposure to worldwide travel and to politics. And then, when Buchanan, a lifelong bachelor, became the 15th president of the United States, Harriet stepped into the role of First Lady from 1857 to 1861. She was 27 years old. Imagine. Later, Harriet married Baltimore banker Henry Johnston. The couple were a part of Baltimore's high society, and there was a high society in Baltimore in those days. At the meantime, though, the couple was devastated when both of their young sons died of rheumatic fever. The Johnstons later funded what will become the Harriet Lane Clinic, located in Johns Hopkins Hospital. It was the first hospital in the country devoted to children. Mrs. Johnston insisted that children from all races, creeds, and nationalities have access to care. So the Harriet Lane Clinic, as many of you probably recognize the name, is still in Johns Hopkins Hospital. And each year on her birthday, pediatric nurses from the clinic place flowers on Harriet Lane Johnston's grave in Greenmount Cemetery. Another woman buried in Greenmount Cemetery, Martha Ann Patty Adipus. Martha Ann Adipus, who was called Patty, was born around 1816 and was a slave to William McCubbin. When he died, his widow sold Patty to Dr. John Whitridge for $200. The Whitridges lived at 49 North Charles Street, which is about in the vicinity of Charles Center today. For the rest of her life, Patty worked as a nurse for the family. She died in 1874. So Patty was buried in the family plot in Greenmount Cemetery. The inscription reads, "A faithful and devoted nurse in the family of Dr. John Whitridge for over 36 years. However, it did not become clear to the public that Miss Adipus was a domestic slave until a remarkable discovery here in Maryland in the early 2000s. A daguerreotype of Patty, as well as a tintype of her holding young Alice Lee Wittridge were discovered among items that were auctioning for sale in Sparks, Maryland. That's Patty with Alice Lee Wittridge. The lot also contained Patty's bill of sale. The Maryland Center for History and Culture purchased these items, and they are currently on display at their local museum. The images and the bill of sale serve as a reminder of the realities of urban slavery here in Baltimore. Okay, Mary Pickersgill. Now, this is a name that everybody recognizes, and we're going to travel up to Loudon Park Cemetery to learn more. Her grave is always surrounded by flats every time I've been there. Mary Pickersgill was a 37-year-old widow who operated her flag-making business from her home near Fells Point. Most likely, she had enslaved people as well as indentured servants for labor and support and for helping to keep her household going. Mary was awarded the contract to make the 30 by 42-foot garrison flag that would fly at nearby Fort McHenry. The flag was so large that it was laid out in a nearby brewery for them to work on. Those workers included Mary, of course, her daughter, nieces, and other seamstresses who worked late into the night to meet the 7-week delivery deadline on the flag. We also know that one of her workers, at least, was a young African-American girl named Grace Wisher. She was 13 years old when she worked on the flag. The flag was delivered on time, August 19th, 1813, which was just a year before the bombardment of the fort, and when the flag would go down in history as the inspiration for our national anthem. So even today, historians are continuing to work on finding out more about the women, black and white, free and not, who created the American flag at Fort McHenry. We're going to talk about 2 black nuns who were instrumental in Baltimore's history and who probably, at least one of them, this one, is not as well known as she probably should be. So we're talking about Sister Mary Anthony Duchemin. She came to Baltimore as Marie Ann Maxis, and she came during the Haitian Revolution with the Duchemin family, so then she became known as Betsy Duchemin. Around 1829, Betsy, a trained nurse, entered the Oblate Sisters of Providence and became known as Sister Mary Anthony. In 1832, Baltimore was at the peak of a worldwide cholera epidemic. The Oblate Sisters took care of many of the city's poor, and including those who lived in almshouses. At the time, Catholic Archbishop James Whitfield heard of her reputation and called for Sister Mary Anthony when he became ill with cholera. The Archbishop recovered. She nursed him back to health. He later asked her to return to take care of his housekeeper. However, after she did, within 24 hours, Sister Mary Anthony had died from cholera. So as I alluded to before, the racism of the day prevails in this story. None of the Black sisters who were recognized for this devotion to duty during the pandemic in Baltimore. Instead, the White Sisters of Charity received accolades for their work for years. And this history is just now being righted. Now, if anybody is a cemetery aficionado here or online, I'm going to say that we are not exactly sure where Sister Mary Anthony is buried. We believe she was first buried in New Cathedral Cemetery. However, we've not been able to confirm that. So please contact me at the Maryland Women's Heritage Center if you know anything about that, so I can correct this record. Just this past June, the Catholic Church took another step in declaring Baltimore's Mother Mary Elizabeth Lang as a saint. Elizabeth Lang was born around 1789 in what is now Haiti to a well-off family. She fled the country during a revolution and came to Baltimore, where many Catholic, French-speaking refugees had settled. So prior to the Emancipation Proclamation, there was no public education for Black children in Baltimore. So Sister set up a school for Black children in her Fells Point neighborhood. And then in 1828, along with Father James Joubert, Elizabeth Lang, and two other Black women started the first Black Catholic school in America here in Baltimore. A year later, Elizabeth Lang, along with three other Black women, pronounced vows to become the first religious order of women of African American descent, and they were called the Oblate Sisters of Providence, who still exist today. And she became known at that time as Sister Mary Elizabeth Lang. Sister Mary Elizabeth Lang continued to educate children and meet the needs of the Black community for the rest of her life. The Oblate Sisters in Baltimore also provided a home for orphans and an education for freed slaves. And they as well were involved in the 1832 cholera epidemic. They sheltered the elderly and even served as domestics up at St. Mary's Seminary. Mother Mary Elizabeth Lang died on February 3rd, 1882. In 2013, her remains were moved from the New Cathedral Cemetery on Old Frederick Road, and she now rests at the Oblate Sisters of Providence Chapel on Gun Road, which is in Halethorpe, a little bit outside the city. Over the past couple of years, the Maryland Women's Heritage Center has done a lot of work in identifying women in Maryland who worked for the passage of the 19th Amendment that confirmed women had the right to vote. We've identified more than 100, most of whom were previously unrecognized women who were really active, and some of whom actually went to jail for their belief that women could vote. One of the earliest women that we have identified is Elizabeth Chalk Herring. Now, Elizabeth was born into a Baltimore working class family. Her father, Elias, worked as a mechanic and a laborer at the Landvale factory in the Jones Falls Valley. Elizabeth herself worked as a seamstress at home along with her 6 siblings. And she later married Wilton S. Herring, a Northern Central Railway freight agent. The couple reared 3 children in Govinstown. In February 1890, Wilton Herring died suddenly. Despite this fact, it did not stop Elizabeth from continuing to fight for several causes that were close to her heart. She was involved in a lot of church organizations, and she went on to national level activism as a member of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Now, we found in our research that a lot of the women who were suffragists also were very involved in the temperance movement. And so Elizabeth herself was also involved in that. She really had a lot of alliances. The thing is, especially for these early suffragists, many of them died before the passage of the 19th Amendment, before they could see the fruits of their labors for suffrage, which was sort of sad. There were certainly a number of them who were able to celebrate, but sadly not people like Elizabeth Herring. So Elizabeth died on June 6, 1926, and was buried alongside of her husband in Loudon Park Cemetery. And for those of you who know the area in the back, you can see the top of the monastery that is in the background of that slide. The monastery on Frederick Road. Okay, they say you can't pick your family. And so that's probably no better example of that than Asia Sidney Booth. So Asia was as shocked as the rest of the nation when she read the newspaper on April 15, 1865, to learn that her brother, John Wilkes Booth, was wanted for assassinating President Abraham Lincoln. At the time, she was in Philadelphia, living there with her husband. She was pregnant with twins and confined to bed. So not too long after the news broke, detectives had appeared at her door in Philadelphia and took off Asia's husband, John Clark, who was taken to the old Capitol and detained and questioned. Eventually released, Clark asked for a divorce because he did not want to be associated with the family of an assassin. It ended up that the divorce didn't happen, but the records show that the marriage remained strained forever. And in truth, the whole Booth family never really uh, recovered their formerly good reputation. Asia and her family moved to England. She went on to lose 3 more children. It was said that her husband was unfaithful and she had health issues, but more than anything, she truly missed her country, but felt that she couldn't return. She was, however, an author and a poet, and she wrote the book, John Wilkes Booth, A Sister's Memoir, that explored Booth's personality and his childhood. And it is a prized book to historians because it's the only book that really gives some insight into John Wilkes Booth's background, his childhood, and some of his upbringing. So a little farther out, away from Baltimore, is the Booth is Tudor Hall, which was the home of the Booths for several years, including Asia. John Wilkes Booth lived there. It's, if I didn't say this, it's near Hartford Community College and above Bel Air. John Wilkes Booth lived there with his mother, his brother Joseph, Asia, and another sister from 1852 through most of 1856. Asia is buried with her husband in the Booth family plot in Greenmount Cemetery. And as an aside, most of the facts point to the fact that John Wilkes Booth is also buried in that area, but nobody really knows the exact location of his remains in the Booth family plot. It's just, I think they just felt like it needed to be a secret and kept from angry moms, I guess. Okay, so I mentioned in the beginning that all these women are very different from one another, and Jane Claudia Saunders Johnson is an example of one opinion. Jane Claudia Saunders was born into a politically connected family who lived on a southern plantation. And then she became even more politically connected when she married Brigadier General Bradley T. Johnson of the 1st Maryland Regiment of the Confederate States Army. In May of 1861, about 500 men went to Point of Rocks, Maryland, and into Harper's Ferry, the area in that area where the states converge, to be sworn in as Confederate States soldiers in the 1st Maryland Regiment. They had few supplies and weapons since Maryland had not left the Union at that point forever. So Mrs. Johnson, with her Southern ties, volunteered to return to North Carolina to raise money for her husband's regiment and for the Confederate cause. And throughout the war, Mrs. Johnson followed her husband to his various outposts and army camps throughout Virginia. She provided social activities for the soldiers. She put on theater productions, dances. She maintained a reading library and worked with the traveling pastors and ministers to make sure that her husband's troops worshipped on Sunday. Jane Claudia Johnson died on December 31st, 1899. Her headstone in Loudon Park Cemetery includes a tribute by Confederate soldiers in Maryland that says, "In memory of a noble woman." And then finally, we have women who sacrifice whatever they can for their children, and those children turn out to shape a new generation in Baltimore. And we're talking about Judith Solomon Cohen. Judith Cohen was the matriarch of one of the earliest Jewish families in Baltimore. She and her husband Israel had immigrated from England to Richmond, where he worked as a constable. However, Israel died in 1803, and the house and belongings were auctioned off, since women were not allowed to own property in Virginia. So Judith moved to Baltimore with a goal in mind. She wanted her 6 sons and 1 daughter to get a good education. And at the time, the state of Virginia also refused higher education to people who were Jewish. So as a result of that education, Judith's children turned into have an incredibly influential force in Baltimore. And I'm going to name some of the children. Jacob founded a bank, was president of the city council, and a director for the B&O Railroad. Mendez became a noted archaeologist and donated his antiquities to Johns Hopkins University. Benjamin and David helped to found the Baltimore Stock Exchange. Joshua was a pioneer ear specialist, and Philip was a postmaster in Norfolk, Virginia. So her fight and her work for an education for her children really did change the shape of Baltimore. So the family and most of the descendants are buried or memorialized in Baltimore Hebrew Cemetery. It's a family plot. That's the larger memorial to Judith and her husband, and then in front of those 2 memorials are just dozens of footstones that travel down into the back of that picture that represent the further generations of the Cohen family. And this, you probably recognize this place if you've driven down Bel Air Road. It's the outside of the Baltimore Hebrew Cemetery on Bel Air Road, near the city. So we have met Baltimore women who married royalty, the almost forgotten wife of Edgar Allan Poe, 2 nuns, a Confederate wife, a domestic slave, a suffragist, and a Jewish mother who insisted that her children get good educations, and those children made an indelible mark on Baltimore. There are a lot of takeaways here, and for me, I mean, you could go on and on about what these 10 women represent, but for me, these are just 10 women who lived more than 150 years ago. And it begs the question, how many other women don't we know about? Women who have changed their communities, who have invented things, who have been the first of things, and that we've forgotten them. They haven't gotten into the history books. And so at the Maryland Women's Heritage Center, we are trying the best we can to change that by adding her story to history to tell our story. So one more thing, I mentioned to someone up here that I was going to talk a little bit about this building and the women who live there or who work there at the end of the presentation. The Women's Industrial Exchange, that building dates to right after the Civil War. And it was set up by some Baltimore society women who wanted to give an opportunity for women who were sort of down on their luck to discreetly earn a living. And so for decades, that building, it had apartments above the building there, and then there was also a consignment shop that's in the front where the window is, and then in the back, for many of us who grew up in Baltimore in the mid-century, there was a restaurant there. You were waited on with waitresses who had been there forever, who were very committed to the Women's Industrial Exchange, and who served legendary chicken salad and tomato aspic and a couple other things that were just really known at the Women's Industrial Exchange. The exchange, in one way or another, led up to the present time, late 10 years ago or so. And eventually the exchange the whole building was given to Marion House, which is a Baltimore-based shelter for women who are working their way back to independence. So the apartments in the top are leased to women who are working to get their lives together. The restaurant does not exist anymore, although amazingly, it doesn't look that much different than it did in 1960 or 1970 if you walk back there. And in the front is our event space, and we have a lot of exhibits about women, and we hold our local events there, even though we're a statewide organization. A couple of years ago, we applied for and won a grant from the Baltimore National Heritage Area to research the history of not only the building, but the women who worked there and women who sold their crafts there. And it's a historical person researcher's dream, because the truth of it is, when that building closed, as the Women's Industrial Exchange and the restaurant closed down, pretty much a lot of the records, a lot of the artifacts, some of the dishes, some of the kitchenware was put into closets and never seen again, until we started rooting around in there and looking to see what's in there. There are tremendous. It was just a treasure trove of artifacts from the Women's Industrial Exchange. We put out calls for anybody who has either knows somebody whose parents, mother worked for the Industrial Exchange, or who lunched there, to come and tell us their stories. And we're putting together an entire exhibit. It's already started with not only a combination of what we found there, including a thank you note from Katharine Hepburn, who lunched there in the closet someplace. We got it out. And during 2024, if you watch our website, if you watch our social media pages, you'll see how this is starting to come to fruition. If you have any stories about the Women's Industrial Exchange, contact me or go on our website and let us know. Somebody will get back to you. And if you would like to volunteer for us, we need researchers, we need people to help set up programs, we need people to help us raise funds, or if you want to attend a program, please go on our website, sign up to get our correspondence, and we would love to see you. The other thing that we have real quick is that window that's there at the Exchange now houses a rotating exhibit of women artists in Maryland. So every 2 months or so, we change the window out, and it features a really diverse array of women artists in Maryland. So that's what I have today. Does anybody have any questions? Thank you. Thank you for having me. Hi. Thank you. That's a really good question. The question is, do we work with other Maryland or Baltimore organizations that represent diverse groups that would be able to help us find more women and to find out more stories? We are definitely doing that. One of our upcoming artists is a woman who runs a Puerto Rican cultural center and it's called Tola's Room. She's our next artist. In fact, I think she's already set up in the window. However, we are way open to people to partnering with other organizations. We know that partnering with other organizations brings strength to both of us. We partnered with the Poe Museum. We partnered with Babe Ruth. There are a couple others that I'm drawing a blank on. But if you or someone else can connect us with other organizations, that's really important to us to build our diversity. Yes. Mm. Thank you. Julie is on the staff here at Enoch Pratt and said that she just happened to see some old pictures from the Harriet Lane Clinic while doing some other research and noted the diversity, you said from the 60s, right? Noted the diversity among the patients, the children that were pictured in the photographs. Thank you so much. Visit us online and find out more about the Maryland Women's Heritage Center. And I appreciate the Pratt Library having us today.